All right, welcome everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to be with you today for the virtual reading group. We are in the midst of reading Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition, sometimes called the Vita Activa, which was her original title, and the title still on the German book. We are at the end of the chapter on action. Uh, the chapter on action is probably the most quoted and discussed of all of the chapters in the human condition. As I've said a number of times, there's a sort of overemphasis, I think, in the reading of the human condition on these three central chapters on labor, work, and action, which is not at all to say they're unimportant, but they've been seen as the central core of the book. And one thing to think about as we finish the third of these chapters today on action is to what extent what are these chapters doing in the book? These three chapters on labor, work, and action. They're chapters on what Arendt calls the sort of faculties of the vita activa, of human of our life of action. And she wants to say that all three of these faculties, labor, work, and action, go to the very, or at some level, faculties that all humans, at least within a certain range of human history, have been capable of and have participated in. We've all needed to work, we've all needed to labor, and we've all needed to act. And to some degree, these three comprise the human condition. That there is, that in some way, of being human, not as a nature, because it's not in our nature to labor, work, and action per se. We can easily imagine us not having to do any of these three things given our biology. But in the world that we've created and inherited, these three activities of the human condition, faculties of the human condition, of human action, the vita activa, are for her central. There are others, right? Thinking is one that will pop up at times, but she doesn't think it's as central. She doesn't think as many people think as they do act, or labor, or work. And so she doesn't see that as one of the core faculties. So today we've talked about action, and we've said that action, as one of these core faculties, is the one that is highest, that is most associated with being human. In order to be one of the core aspects of being human is to labor, is to create the things that we need to live, whether it's food or housing or shelter. But that sort of doesn't completely distinguish us from other beings that need to live. We humans can work, and in creating work, we build a lasting world. And that is a distinctively, to some degree, a distinctively human characteristic, although other species also build things that last. That's not what she's going to rest this on. But in the end, work and the products of work have a problem, which is that we create things as means to an end. And that means to an end means that these things don't have meaning. Even artwork, which she thinks is the most durable work we can create, and the work that is as distant from the means and rationality as we can. Even artwork only really has meaning and brings meaning into the world insofar as it enters the world and is engaged and talked about, and stories are told about it, and it becomes meaningful insofar as it enters the world and thus acts. And so action, which is really the faculty of self-revelation of humans, action, which is where we tell stories and we act in the world and create meaning, is really, to her, the most human of these faculties, because at the root of what it means to be human for Arendt is to be able to be free to create meaning, or to be free to be meaningful. That means you have to be able to act in a public world in order to have people notice you, take cognizance of you. The great evil of slavery for Arendt is not necessarily economic. It's the dehumanization of slavery, insofar as slaves are not allowed to enter and have a public world or public life. And so the sort of the real pith or core of what Arendt is after in this chapter on action is the creation of meaning. And having said that, we come, we've talked about in the last week, the way in which there is a traditional animosity towards and fear of action throughout the political tradition, because action is unruly and because it can lead to the death of Socrates, amongst other tragedies. It is unpopular at all times, and there's always a temptation to replace action with what she's going to call making, to do away with plurality and to do away with the disorder and the sort of democratic pluralism of action, an action which is a beginning but needs others to make it an end. And replace it with what she's going to call the violence and coherence of making. Okay, that's since we're at the end of this chapter in action, I just want to remind us of where we are. And so now we come to these three final paragraphs, sections in the chapter in action, which go together, right? The process character of action raises the problem that action is confronted with in the modern age, right? So earlier we dealt with other problems. There was the problem of the frailty of action, right? The Greeks encountered the problem of the frailty of action, which is, how do you convince people to have the courage to act in public where they might get killed or exiled or embarrassed or lose their income? How do you convince these Greeks to do that when without, when it's so dangerous, and to create meaning and to create the meaning that is the sense of what it means to be human, and for which we need a polis? And her answer is, well, we create a public space of appearances so that there's a chance of immortality, which offers them a reason to act despite the dangers. We then see that against this Greek solution to the frailty of action, you have the whole tradition of political thought, which seeks to replace action with making. We now come to these last three chapters, in which she's going to say there's been a fundamental shift, right? And this is the shift that's going to set the tone for the last chapter of the book on the Vita Activa and the modern age. The shift is that, and if you look at page 231, it's not an accident that the shift begins with her discussion of scientific experiments. In the age of experimentation, of scientific experiments, right? What do we do in scientific experiments? We create man-thought conditions. I love the way she uses these words, man-thought conditions. We create an experiment and we test things, but the way we test them are not natural ways, right? We create new conditions, man-thought conditions. And through these experiments that are based upon man-thought conditions, she says, force nature to follow man-made patterns. So we create, look, things always fell, right? There was always gravity. There were always, the idea of entropy or energy, but we didn't know them, and therefore we couldn't act upon them in a way. But once we create man-thought experiments where we identify and isolate these forces, and then we can now, using these forces, create man-made patterns in which we force nature into these man-made patterns. What this means, and this is, by the way, both in natural science, but even more so, or both in history. And so what you have are the emergence of what Vico called the new science of history, and what Max Planck and others will call sort of the new modern science, which are radical departures from, medieval or ancient or pre-modern science, in which you create man-made stories in history and man-made experiments in natural science, and you force the natural world and the world of the past into patterns that we make. This is what she calls, and then once you do that as a historian or as a natural scientist, you're acting into the world. You are making the natural world and the historical world fit new human-made patterns. That's a freedom. That's an action. And it's different from the freedom and the action that the Greeks responded to the frailty of action with, because the frailty of action, again, the problem it's dealing with is immortality or mortality, and it seeks a kind of mortality. The problem that modern science, historical and natural science, deal with is not immortality. The problem modern and natural science deal with is that once we act into the world and create stories, we get caught up in them. We become part of them, and thus we lose our freedom. We become, in the very act of acting and thus creating processes and webs and stories, we become part of it, and thus we lose our freedom. Out of this, as she'll call it on page 233, this despair, right, from the realm and contempt for the human capacity for freedom, which by producing the web of human relationships seems to entangle its producer to such an extent, now we're on to 234, that he appears much more the victim and the sufferer than the author and doer of what he has done. We lose our freedom in that by creating these processes, these stories, these histories, these experiments, these new scientific concepts, we lose our control. Now, she's now going to make a distinction which is absolutely central to all of her work, and that's between different ideas of freedom. And what she's going to say is the idea of freedom in which we lose control and lose our freedom in these processes is a kind of sovereignty. It's an idea that we are in absolute control. And she'll say in her essay, What is Freedom?, that the most dangerous idea in politics is the idea of freedom as sovereignty. And here she's going to say that the error that we make is to identify sovereignty with freedom on page 234. And instead, she wants to identify freedom with plurality, with a kind of a political plurality in which we can act not so that we will be in control, but that we imagine that we recognize that in fact our actions will lead to webs and things in which we will be caught up, and yet we don't. We maintain our freedom as actors within those new stories and webs of relationships. And she then ends this section 32 on page 235 to 236 with a question, right? The bottom of 235, she begins to frame the question. She says, the question which arises is whether our notion that freedom and non-sovereignty are mutually exclusive, namely that freedom needs to have a non-sovereign world, because if you have a sovereign idea, then freedom is lost in a world of processes. So whether our notion that freedom and non-sovereignty are mutually exclusive is not defeated by reality. Or to put it another way, whether the capacity for action does not harbor within itself certain potentialities which enable it to survive the disabilities of non-sovereignty. So what is this question? The question is, can we, at the one hand, act and create histories and natural scientific processes that create webs in which we are caught, and still be free? Can we still be free in a world of non-sovereignty? What would it mean to act freely in such a world? And she then, in the last two sections of this chapter on action, offers two answers. One is we can act freely through the power of forgiveness, and one is we can act freely through the power of promising. These are non-sovereign ways of acting that allow us still to experience freedom. That's the claim here. Okay. Action and insofar as they are actions, powers of forgiving and promising, she says that action has within itself the potential to redeem itself from its danger, namely that it leaves us in a world of a web of stories and meanings and relationships that are irreversible and unpredictable, and against which we seem to have no sovereign control. Okay, we don't have sovereign control, but we can have some freedom still within this world. And so, what are these two activities that she develops? What is forgiving? She bases this in her reading of Jesus of Nazareth. Interestingly enough, she'll, to a large degree, base her reading of promising in a reading of Abraham and the covenants. So she goes back in both chapters to religious texts, and honestly, I just thought of that and need to think about why. So I haven't come up with an answer to that. So happy to take questions on that or hear your thoughts on it. It just popped into my head. The discoverer of the role of forgiveness in the human affairs was Jesus of Nazareth. The key here, right? The key here is her retranslation of the quotation in Luke 17. And this is going to happen on pages 239 to 240 at the bottom. This is an extraordinary uh, uh, reading of a well-known biblical passage. And let's just take a quick look at it. So in the typical translation of Luke 17, it says, and if he trespass against thee 7 times a day, and 7 times in a day turn again to thee, saying, I repent, thou shalt forgive him. So what she then does is says, look, there are 3 key words in this passage. One is affine, which is translated as forgiveness, which really means to release. The other is metanoien, which is translated as repent, which really means to change one's mind, metanoien, to go beyond one's opinion or mind. And the last is hamartain, which means to go astray. And so if she says, if you actually pay attention to what these words that are attributed to Jesus mean in the original Greek of the Bible, she says what they actually mean, and she then puts her translation at the bottom of footnote 78 on page 240. And if he trespass against thee and turn again to thee, saying, I changed my mind, thou shalt release him. Why is this important? Both revenge and forgiveness for Arendt spring from what she calls the Christian solidarity based on original sin, or based on sin and original and equality of man. Namely, that we forgive, or God forgives in Christianity, and now also man forgives, because we're all sinners and all of us could have done the sin. And we take revenge because we are all able to avenge the sin. There's a fundamental mistrust of humanity, that we're all sinners. And both of these, revenge and forgiveness in the Christian theology or Christian understanding, erase politics. They erase plurality of difference. They erase judgment, because the whole point is we're all equal. Nobody can judge. And in her Denktagebuch and in some other works, Arendt distinguishes from revenge and forgiveness another idea called reconciliation. And I've written a lot on this, but the point is that reconciliation is a political act in which we actually make a judgment to reconcile or not with certain sins or evils that have happened. She doesn't think forgiveness is a political act of that level. The way she's using forgiveness here is more as this idea of mutual release. And it depends upon the fact that what we release are not sins, but trespasses or transgressions. So she makes a distinction here on page 240 between trespass and crime, or trespass and sin. And the point is that sin is a willed evil or a crime that you can't just forgive. But every day when we act, we trespass. We do things that, because of the unpredictability of action, because every action is going to have unintended consequences, we do things that are bad, not willfully. And when you are made aware of those, we must metanoien, change our mind, repent. And if we do, we should be released, affine, forgiven. And that this release, this mutual release from the unintended consequences of trespasses, of action that goes astray, which all action will, is what makes action possible. And that is the reason that the act of forgiveness, in this sense, mutual release, makes action possible by releasing us from the unintended and bad consequences of our actions, and thus redeems the unpredictability and irreversibility of action. There's a short section on love and respect at the end. Maybe we'll come back to that in Q&A. I'm just a little out of time. Unpredictability and the power of promise, which is the last chapter, which has its source now in Abraham and all covenants, as opposed to Jesus, is the power of stabilization, right? The unpredictability and irreversibility of action is the price of freedom, that when we act freely, we don't know where it's going to go. And yet, not only do we need to be released from the unintended and bad consequences of our actions, but there have to be ways in which, in acting, we can create some islands of predictability and stability that don't reimpose a sovereignty and thus eliminate freedom, but that allow us to have some stability amidst plurality and thus non-sovereignty. And this is what Arendt takes promising to be. In that sense, promising is an action based in natality, and thus it's a miracle. It is the miracle that in each human being, we have the capacity to act, to start things new, and in starting things new, create islands of predictability that will provide for a non-sovereign freedom in the political world. So that's how the section on action ends. It's also thus how this whole 3 middle sections of the book on labor, work, and action end, with the way that labor was redeemed, she says, by work, right? In labor, we consume and we have no lasting world. Work redeems labor by creating a lasting world. Well, work creates a lasting world, but it's not a meaningful world because there's no criteria to judge works through work. So we need action, stories to create meanings. But then action is troubled by its frailty and later its burden of unpredictability, such that why would we act in a world in which actions give us very little and are dangerous and often lead to ill? And the answer is that action contains within itself its own redemption in the miracle of forgiveness and promising. So that's how these 3 middle chapters end. The overarching question that they raise, right, is okay, insofar as we are increasingly living in a world of science and automation and a feeling in which everything is determined, what happens to this vita activa, these labor, work, and action in the modern age? And that's going to be the chapter, the topic of the last chapter, to me the most important and core chapter of the book, the vita activa and the modern age. Okay, I'll stop there. I went on a little longer than usual. There's already a bunch of questions, which is great. You can, just a reminder, and most of you know this, there's a chat that it seems quite active already, and you can use the chat function to talk to each other and make comments, try and keep it civil. There's also, you can go down to the reactions tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen and click on raise hand and get in the queue. I ask you to keep your questions short and to the point to the extent possible. And remember, we're trying to read and engage the work of Hannah Arendt in a meaningful way. All right. First question is Bob Meyerson.
Thank you. I have to leave before the end of the hour, so I jumped to the head of the line. I'm interested in the part you skipped on page 242, where she notes toward the bottom, love by its very nature is unworldly. And we know she wrote her Habilitation on love and Augustine, neighborly love, and then the book on Rahel Varnhagen, which is a lot about love and here. And my question is, the motto for the center, or maybe it's this group, is Amor Mundi, which seems to be very worldly. So how do we reconcile Amor Mundi with her concept of love on page 242?
Wonderful question. So what she, and I have to think through an answer, so you're going to have to bear with me for a second. What she means by love on page 242, right? Being unworldly, is that when we are in love, we lose ourselves in each other. It has an unequaled clarity of vision, right? If you're in love, you understand your lover in a way that you rarely ever understand another person. But this love, this clarity of self-revelation, is unconcerned to the point of total unworldliness with what the loved person may be. You don't, often when I go to a party, I'll say to someone, oh, what do you do? Or who are you in the world? But if you're in love with someone, that's not what your worry is, right? You're not worried with their worldliness. And so she says, love destroys this in between, which relates to us and separates us from others. And as long as that spell lasts, the lovers are basically separate from the world, which is why I hate to tell this to all of you married people with children end love, right? Because once you have children, you now are in a world, and the sort of that sort of world of imaginary love in which you exist just for each other, in your essence, is destroyed. And she says that once the end of love happens, there are really only two possibilities. Now, this is a woman who never had children, so let's just keep this in mind. But she said either the love affair must start anew, right? Or be transformed into another mode of belonging together, right? These are the two options that she sees. And thus, love is unworldly and even anti-political. So Bob asks this question about Amor Mundi, and I all I can say is that in Amor Mundi, when she says love of the world, she's not talking about love in this romantic or sense of love. I don't think. The Amor Mundi lines all come about in discussions of what I mentioned earlier, reconciliation. To love the world is to accept the world as it's been given, and to love it as it's been given, not because it's always the best world. In fact, it never is, and there's no such thing, but because there's a gift in existence. And in reconciling to the world, we make a judgment, a political judgment, that despite all the bad in it, the world is still lovable and worth living in. That doesn't mean we can't work to change it, but we have to start from where we're at. And so Amor Mundi is an expression of a reconciliation with the world, and thus an affirmation that despite all the evils in it, we love it. It's just a different idea of love, Bob. I don't think, I think that this is one of those places where she's just using love to mean something else, if that's an acceptable cop out. I hope it's not a cop out of an answer. I think she's just using the word differently. Is that, I mean, do you want to resist that?
No, I suspected she was using the one word in two different ways. And maybe she uses other words in more than one way as well.
Yeah, she does.
But it puts me, you're a Leibniz scholar, and it puts me in mind of Leibniz and Voltaire's ridicule of Leibniz.
Yeah, well, Arendt didn't think there was anything like the best of all possible worlds. So her love of the world is not a love of utopia or perfection. It's a love of the world with evil in it. And, to the extent that Leibniz's theogony is an attempt to justify a world with evil in it as the best of all possible worlds, Arendt would not accept the Leibnizian spin on it, although she would agree with Leibniz that the world with evil in it is lovable.
Roger, could I just jump in? I'm going to jump in and say, from my personal feeling right now, and I'm really fighting to stay in love with the world. I believe now, with all the backtracking on critical race theory, intersectionality, all of these things are not, wokeness is now considered, if you read David Brooks recently and others, we have gone too far. We are now, and there's a lot of people who have every right to hate the world, who have been trying to hold the world accountable. And now we're going to, the smoke is clear. George Floyd, the place didn't blow up. Some of us are still trying to understand, why the fuck should I love this fucking world?
Yeah.
And that's where, and so it is not abstract.
No, you're right.
Because I think I got mine is what we get. The lesson is about this fucking work. Excuse it, but I'm a little upset today. Yeah. I got mine. Yeah. Don't worry about his.
Yeah,
and that's what the world is. The world is an opportunity to get mine for my people. I think Hannah Arendt in this Amor Mundi is still holding out the possibility that we could all care, that we all get ours. And that's all I have to say on this question of Amor Mundi. That's the challenge, I think, now about what does it mean to love the world? And I said it to my Christian fundamentalist sister recently, and her son, who is lying in bed and dying. And both of them are Christians. And I said, do you love the world? And they said, no, we don't. Yeah. Because they think that the whole purpose of this is to get to the place after the world, yeah. Heaven. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. First of all, I'm sorry about your nephew. That's awful.
That's not awful. We live and we die. That's what this world is, right? Do you love it? Do you love a world where people die young? People are killed? So you don't have to apologize for it. Let's blame God if you believe in God. What do we do with the world that this happens in? Now she's telling us to love it.
Yeah, she is. And, you mentioned a litany of challenges to that today, starting with that people die young of all types, that there are wars, that there are pandemics, that there is racism, and others.
There's injustice that has been with us for thousands of years.
Yeah, Arendt is writing and posing this question amidst the Holocaust, right? I mean, she posed this question of loving the world at a time when her closest friends and lovers had betrayed her, at a time when her country had tried to exterminate her and did exterminate many of her friends and family members. And she asks this question, can I love the world? And her answer is yes. Where does this come from? Not from Christianity, right? And you're absolutely right. Not from Christianity, not from, she's not a Christian, not from Judaism. It comes for her from politics. It comes from her from a political judgment, a reconciliation that the world, that we have to, that the way to act amidst a horrific world and an unjust world, which is always going to exist, sometimes more visibly than others, is to understand that we are miracles and we can recreate, we can build it, we can act, and we have that ability to act, forgive, promise, build, and reconfigure. And that's
if we don't starve to death.
If we don't starve to death.
If we're not shot dead in the street.
And if we don't starve to death and don't starve in the street, and if we do starve to death, and if we are shot down in the streets, which is an injustice, our lives can actually be deeply meaningful for the struggle for justice, which might mean that, you know, I mean, as she says, sometimes the most human lives are the shortest and the most tragic, which is why she doesn't think there should be a human right to life. She thinks that to be human is to die well, to have the courage to act and see what happens. You know, and you can only do that, she says, if you love the world enough to encounter it as it is and insist that it be better. That's what she means by amor mundi.
I would just jump in to say that I believe it's among the Dakota, when they went into battle, the leader, the chief would say, Indians, today is a good day to die. And I think that's very much in the same Arendtian spirit.
It's very much in the Arendtian spirit. You know, when I teach my Arendt and human rights introductory class, I make, you know, after we go through this Arendtian view on human rights, we'd always talk about UN policy in Palestine and Israel, in which you basically created, you know, a whole civilization living in bureaucratically controlled refugee camps to keep people alive. From an Arendtian perspective, this is dehumanizing. More human would be, to quote the Lakota, this is a good day to die. This is a good day to fight. Now, we're repelled by that, right? We're living in a world where we value life above all, security above all. Amor mundi doesn't come from that mentality.
Are you sure there's a we in that sentence, Roger?
No, not necessarily, Bill. I mean, I guess I'm talking about what I take to be the tradition from Hobbes, you know, which is that security and life is and liberalism. But I do think it's the dominant way that most people today view things. They think of human rights as the right to be kept secure, not to die well. There are obviously exceptions. I mean, I'm not trying to say that there aren't. I would never, but I think it's indisputably the vastly dominant way that we understand these questions today. Amanda.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah, I had a question that had to do more with the introduction when you were talking about when the artwork enters the world or when actions enter the world, they acquire meaning in that way, and also in the way that when stories get told and retold, that acquires meaning. And so I was wondering, I mean, as pertains to artwork, many people have made all kinds of artwork throughout history, but not all of them get retold. Many get omitted from that retelling and entering the world, and in fact, would remain more private as a result, and maybe, emerge decades later, if not ever. So what does that mean about what does that mean about freedom for those kinds of actions to be possible?
Great question, Amanda, and some wonderful artwork behind you. So thanks for sharing that. Arendt's, I don't know if you were with us when we talked about the chapters on art a couple weeks ago, but for Arendt, an artist works and must, to a certain extent, and we talked a lot about this, so I don't want to rehash the whole thing, must to a certain extent work in solitude, outside of the public sphere. And the reason, put simply, is that if an artist is too caught up in public debates and public discourses, their work will not be surprising and original, and thus have the capacity to shock or garner attention, such that it will be talked about in ways that make it meaningful. And so, to the extent that for Arendt, artists are engaged and too much part of the public world, they don't have the space to think and create works that will act and garner attention when they enter the world. Now, sometimes works are so original that they enter the world and they're ignored for generations or years until somebody sees them and finds in them meaning and starts talking about them. It doesn't always happen right away, and that's true not just for art, but for any kind of action. A speech by Pericles can inspire people throughout the ages, just like so can a work of Michelangelo's or the Parthenon. Or not. Some speeches in art age well and some don't. And so her point, I think, Amanda, is that there's there's the difference between the artist who must create in solitude and thus free from the public, and then the act of putting their work into the world. And it's once they do, they lose control over it, and it becomes subject to the judgment of the spectators, whether it's a performance piece or a painting or a poem. And those spectators will either ignore it, destroy it as dangerous, or embrace it. I mean, there's obviously other options, but those are sort of the three main ones that she talks about. And that will be based on how shocking or original or striking it is, and then B, whether the original or striking thought is seen as dangerous or a kind of salvation, or new idea that is embraced. We also talked a lot a couple weeks ago about the potential of collective artworks and things like that, and I don't want to rehash that now. You can go back and watch those those sessions if you're interested in it. But does that answer your question? In some way?
Yeah, yes, it does, and thank you for that. I think I was also hoping to talk a little bit more about the connection with freedom in terms of the freedom to act in that sense, whether it's solitary or not. But you know, how much more free is a work that enters the world when it gets retold versus one that is, you know, simply free in its own solitude.
Mhm.
If that makes
Yeah, I
sense.
mean, there's an interesting, important difference between the artist who, for Arendt, creates his work or her work in thought, in solitude, and then actualizes it and then puts it in the world, versus the actor who must act with others. You know, action is acting in concert, or freedom is acting in concert. And to that extent, you know, there is a difference. And the artist acts in private. Now, I mean, if you have a collective, an artist collective, they can sometimes act in private too. I mean, or in solitude. But that is different. There's a different idea of freedom for an artist as there is for a political actor. And insofar as the artist becomes an actor when they put their art in the world, they can be both.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Susan.
Yeah, hi, Roger.
Hey, Susan.
Roger, so at this point in the book, throughout the book, getting my head around Arendt's thoughts of action. So given this world as it is, and perhaps has always been, with different challenges, depending upon when you live, when Arendt talks about acting and inserting yourself into the world, are you still there?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, because my screen just went kind of, I don't see you anymore, but that's okay. Okay. So inserting ourselves into the world via action. And my question may be iterative depending upon your answers, so bear with me just a little bit. So when we insert ourselves into the world through our action, is Arendt saying, sometimes I think she's saying, insert yourself into the world, but do it without an end in mind? Is this an insertion of ourselves into the world acting without a goal or objective? Because I get a little confused when she talks about means and ends, and there's something in there that I think I'm not quite understanding her idea still after all these readings of really what action is. And depending upon your answer, does her definition of action still does it still bode well in the times in which we are living?
Mm-hmm. So when you produce a work, you're working, you're trying to produce something for some end.
Okay.
The artwork is unique, at least the artwork as she understands it in a traditional sense, in that it has no useful end. It's
Hey, Roger, I'm sorry to interrupt you. And I'm actually not talking about art. I'm actually talking
I'm
about.
gonna get there.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Just wanted to make sure I didn't mislead you. Okay.
Yeah. It has no useful end. And yet when you then, if you're a political artist, or once you're an artist and you put your work into the world, of course, as an actor, you're going to act for ends. You're going to act with ends in mind. Her point is not that. Her point is that the ends you set in the end will have no bearing on the meaning and of your action, because in a world of plurality, you don't control the ends of your action. This is the frailty and then the burden of action that this whole chapter is about, is that actors act, and they may act with the worst of intentions or the best of intentions, but we have no idea if our work for social justice is going to lead the world to be a better place or a worse place. Right? We just
Right.
don't know, and we can't know. That's the frailty and the unpredictability and the burden of action. And so what, unlike working, where you can seek to achieve ends, tools that make your life easier and things like that, action you can't justify by the ends. You have to justify it on its own terms. And for her, the reason we act is to be human, to reveal ourselves and to become a who, and to thus be meaningful, and to be a meaningful human being. Action is not about, in the end, improving the world. Of course, we want to act to improve the world, but what she's saying is whether we achieve that or not is not up to us. And so we would all give up action, and we would just, live private lives if there weren't other reasons to act. For the Greeks, that was immortality. But we don't believe in immortality. So what's, okay, to some degree, we still believe in fame and reputation. So that's one reason to act. But another is simply the power and the joy of acting, promising and forgiving. But one of the but here's where we're going for the next few weeks as we read chapter 6 on the vita activa in the modern age. Increasingly, she thinks there are fewer and fewer redeeming reasons to act, and we're living in a world in which the result, the cause or result, we'll talk about this, is that whereas action and self-revelation and meaning was, from the Greeks up until the present, the highest way to actualize being human. This goes back to the point Bill and I were just talking about 5 minutes ago. Today, she says, the way we increasingly determine our humanity is not through meaningfulness and action, but through security and keeping ourselves alive. And this is what she thinks is happening, is that the vita activa has not only elevated itself above the vita contemplativa, right? Go back to the introduction, but more importantly, within the vita activa, the hierarchy of labor, work, action, where action was at the top of what it meant to be humanly meaningful, has been inverted, so that now the highest human activity is simply staying alive.
Okay.
That's going to be the ultimate argument of this text.
Hi, Roger.
I don't know who said that.
Hello, this is Marty.
Hi, Marty.
I think, some more comments on what the actual substantive action I think is necessary at this point, because I think, Arendt talks about the idea of principle and the general nature of action. What does action consist of? Like when you were talking about the labor movement was based on a general principle of justice, right? And I think that is the form of action that Arendt is talking about. But when labor degenerated into just another interest group, among others, and it wasn't for principle of equality and justice, it was self-interest, right? So I think if you can discuss a little bit more about the content of action, I think that would be very helpful.
Okay. Yeah, this is from our readings last week that Marty's bringing it up.
Hey, Roger, while you're contemplating, hey, Marty, I almost want, it's Susan again, I almost want to say from what Roger just said is that it's almost sounding like it's not so much the content of the action, it's the acting that makes us human. Yeah, I mean,
but the
right?
question,
I mean, it's almost doesn't, because I think I was going where you're trying to go, and I'm just what I'm saying. I'm not
but
sure
my
that's where
argument,
she's going.
my argument that there is a content to action.
Marty, you got to speak up a little bit. I can
I'm
barely
sorry.
hear you.
I'm sorry. My argument that there is a content to action, and action just doesn't consist of appearing in public and acting like a butterfly, like Dina once say. It's actually persuading people. Okay, it's not using force or violence. It's using the idea, and that's where the idea of freedom comes in, because you're using persuasion as opposed to work where you actually have a means end, and labor where you just at the yoke of necessity and trying to satisfy necessity. In action, you're using words, and I would also argue that, you know, if there were one talent that action has, she talks about talents as being a natural thing, but one of the talents of action is persuasion, speech, oratory, which I think is also very important as the content of action. But I think where the problem today, I don't think it's against the Arendtian rules for somebody to argue about a specific means end in today's society, because that's what today's society is all about. The problem is that when it degenerates into something self-interested, okay, like, for example, Bernie Sanders is very good, but when he gets into the idea of everybody wants their own goodies, it loses the sense of justice and equality and principle, which I think Arendt is what
Marty, let me respond, because I don't. There was obviously a misunderstanding. There was never. I mean, I think I said to Susan and to Bill that we always act out of interest, social justice, or something else. So to use your example of the labor movement that you brought up on page 219 or so, she does say that the labor movement, which was one of the great movements, political movements of modern era, defended economic interests. And insofar as it did, the labor movement appeared on the public scene. It was the only organization in which men acted and spoke qua men. They spoke as people who demanded that people who had formerly been not citizens, right, laborers and invisible, became visible as citizens. And so in that sense, their action out of interests carried with it a political aspect. Let me just finish, Marty, because but that once the labor movement succeeded, their continued action out of interest, their economic interests, actually led to them increasingly depoliticizing themselves as actors and seeking to simply guarantee certain economic and other goals, and actually led to them disappearing as a political movement and becoming members of society. So the point is that, yes, you always act out of interests, but that doesn't mean that your interest will be successful or that it will lead to what you want it to lead to.
No, but I think there is a distinction between self-interest and the public and just interest, the way Arendt talks about it. She doesn't say self-interest, interest, but between people. So when the labor movement was involved in politics, it was acting out of the interest of all, equality. But when it degenerated into something where it was more of a self-interest, even though it probably wanted to have a political effect, it became anti-political, I would argue, because it was solely concerned with self-interest and not the interest of the society at large.
Okay, I mean, that's not I don't have an issue with that. So, okay, fine.
Roger, can I make a point about the interest?
Can I go back to the
yeah, I got disconnected, so I logged in. But the interesting for Arendt just recovers the etymology. So actually in the etymology, the inter-s, the being in between, would make it contradictory with self-interest, because there is no in between within, oneself. I'm not talking about, the two in one of thinking. So as I understanding, interest for her is kind of quintessentially, if I may say that, something about the world. That's all.
Great. Thank you, Mara. I'm going to go back to the list, and Mara, you're on it. So, although actually it seems like some people have lowered their hands, so we'll see. We don't have that many. Alex.
Hi, Roger. This is Alex X. Alex S.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, I just want to say I found these sections very powerful, especially the last two. And I guess to me, it seems like here we're really getting to the heart of what politics is for Hannah Arendt, especially this idea of redemption. And I've just been trying to think about that, and just to kind of make sense of the few strands that are here. One thing I found I think is important is so politics seems to redeem us from the predicament of the homo faber, which is a kind of, she says it's a kind of meaninglessness, I guess a kind of market mentality where everything becomes a means.
Yeah.
And it seems like politics gives us something like an end in itself. And that seems to be this revelation of the who, of being individuals in appearing for others. And I guess my question is, how promising and forgiveness relate to politics, or the role they have in the political world, or in action. So far we've seen action and speech, right? That's those sort of have been the key activities. And it seems like now we're seeing, well, this is what action and speech do. And in a certain sense, it seems like they redeem time, or they make time meaningful in a way that it wouldn't be possible outside of action. And I guess what I'm wondering is, can we say that every political act is in some ways an act of forgiveness, and in some ways an act of promise? And that, regardless of what the content happens to be, that's how you can tell the political, and that's where this redemptive power comes from.
Thanks, Alex. So there's a few things to say, and one is that on the question of forgiveness, this chapter on forgiveness in the human condition, I find incredibly deceptive in some way within. Let me say this. Let me put it differently. I think it's been wildly misunderstood within Arendtian scholarship. And it's also for me a problematic chapter because she seems to title the chapter about forgiveness and write about forgiveness, but then she actually says, actually, I'm not writing about forgiveness of crimes or willed evil. I'm talking about the mutual release from trespass. And I've had some very interesting debates and conversations with some Arendt scholars about this. And, why is she using the word forgiveness here when she doesn't seem to be talking about forgiveness? She seems to be talking much more about, in her language, a kind of reconciliation, as she writes about in other texts. My best attempt to make sense of it is that she's trying to speak to a wider audience and put it in a and take a religious idea like forgiveness and give it a political spin and give her own sense to the word forgiveness. But in this chapter, the dominant approach is to not talk about forgiveness of crimes or sins. It's to talk about release from trespass, which makes action possible or redeems action, so that we who act in ways that don't intend to do evil, but we know might, are able to still act. She only really goes further and talks about a much stronger idea of forgiveness or reconciliation when she talks about radical evil on page 241. And in that section, she cites Jesus again. It were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck and he cast into the sea. The point is, there are certain things that can't be forgiven and can't be reconciled. She will come back to this exact point in Eichmann in Jerusalem, right? That's the point. Her last judgment of Eichmann in Jerusalem, where she says, the court found you guilty for violating these rules. That's bullshit. You need to simply be killed because what you did, the earth, cries out. And what you did is unpunishable and unforgivable. And so we simply have to kill you. And so that's where she brings in, and that act of forgiveness is political as well, or reconciliation, as she'll call it elsewhere, because in non-reconciliation with a crime, we assert certain parts of our world that we cannot reconcile to. We cannot love, to go back to the Amor Mundi question that Bill raised earlier. There are certain things that are unlovable. Now, for Arendt, that didn't include, didn't include totalitarianism, but it did include Eichmann and what he did. Those things could not be reconciled. They could not be forgiven. They could not be loved. And they had to be, in a sense, a millstone was put around his neck and cast into the sea. On the question of promising, the quality of act is to make bonds with other people, whether it's Black Lives Matter or the Tea Party or a group of people on Twitter who decide to act in public together and create kinds of islands of predictability where they will defend each other and act for each other and act freely in the world. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if that gets to your question per se, Alex, but that's how I look at these chapters. All right. Susan.
So I realize this is just a little nothing she threw in, but it disturbed me on page 242, where toward the bottom, Jesus, love by its very nature is unworldly, and I think I'm getting to understand what that means. And it is for this reason, rather than its rarity. And I don't understand where she's coming from to say it's rare.
Well, I mean, she has a footnote about that, footnote 81. She says the common prejudice that love is as common as romance may be due to the fact that we all learned about it through poetry. But the poets fool us. They are the only ones to whom love is not only a crucial, but an indispensable experience, which entitles them to mistake it for a universal one. Love is, as she says above on the top of page 242, one of the rarest occurrences in human lives, because it is so unworldly that most of us cannot live as pure lovers as the poets would imagine we do. We are always brought back into the world of interest, self-interest, our needs, our desires. Most love is also caught up with power, as we've been told, and rightly so. And most love is caught up with our needs, whether they be erotic needs or physical needs or emotional needs. And then most love ends up being familial love, and she has already said why she thinks that's the end of love. So what she's saying is actual love, where Romeo and Juliet put everything aside and see only each other, is a deeply rare occurrence. I mean, that's her, I don't want to.
So, I mean, she's defining it as romantic love. And as you pointed out, she never had children, because I would submit that most people, I can't say all, but most people who have children would sacrifice everything and anything, including their lives, for those children, and that is love. And so I really, she's defined it in such a narrow way, is what you're saying. It's such a narrow way that she's ruled out so many other kinds of love. And she herself talks about friendship and other things in other places. And I assume she considers those forms of love. So anyhow,
You're right. I mean, this is one of those situations in which she's defined love so narrowly that it doesn't fit most of the things we would today um, uh, um, uh, include in the nature of love. And so, all I can say is there something to be gained from one of Arendt's many distinctions, right? She's trying to distinguish love from care, or even a kind of profound sense of responsibility for one's children. You say it's love, and we talk about it that way. But I think she would read it slightly differently, as that our children politicize us and make us worldly, and make us have to be willing to sacrifice our self-interest for their interest, and it thus creates an interest that bonds us to our children, and thus it's interested, whereas for her, love is disinterested. Again, is it so narrow an idea of love that it's senseless? It's pretty close to it.
And I think so.
And as a result, she'll say it's very rare. Why does she do it? And especially in this context. Giving and the relationship it establishes on 241 is always an eminently personal affair, in which what was done is forgiven for the sake of who did it. This too was clearly recognized by Jesus. Her sins, which are many, are forgiven. And it is the reason for the current conviction that only love has the power to forgive. For love, although it is one of the rarest occurrences, indeed possesses an unequaled power of self-revelation and an unequaled clarity of vision for the disclosure of who. Love, by reason of its passion, destroys the in-between. If it were true, this Christianity assumed that only love can forgive, because only love is fully receptive to who somebody is, forgiving would have to remain altogether outside our considerations. So she's going to dispute this Christian idea that only love can forgive. She's going to argue that forgiveness is part of a political world, and is part of respect more and friendship more than it is love. Why she wants to do that, I don't know. I'd have to
That's okay.
think more about it.
That's fine. Thank you, Roger.
Because
Hi, Spiros. You want to say something?
hi, because she takes this definition of love from Aristotle, Roger. It is not narrowly, it is politically, it's a political definition. She takes this definition from Aristotle.
Yeah, but
Whatever is from Aristotle, friendship is from Arendt amor mundi.
No, Spiros,
This
this definition she takes from Aristotle is not love, it's respect and friendship.
Yes, yes. This is exactly the same thing.
No,
she translates Aristotle, Roger. She transforms.
Yeah, but it's
love.
the point is why does she distinguish love in this very narrow way?
It is not. It's a political law. It is not a romantic law.
I understand.
It's love about the world, not
Okay.
the individuals.
Yeah, no, that's what I said, but I'm trying.
Yes,
Okay.
I'm sure. I agree with you definitely.
Okay. Cool. Thank you. Mara, do you have something else you want to say, Mara?
Yes. Yes. I actually wanted to read a quote. I didn't know I was next, but I actually wanted to read a quote in page 237 and ask a little bit more about it. It says, "Without being bound to the fulfillment of promises, we would never be able to keep our identities." And only
where are we?
Page 237 in
Where?
irreversibility and the power to forgive.
Yeah.
And then she goes on and says, blah, 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 who confirms the identity between the one who promises and the one who fulfills. So I find this fascinating because she doesn't really address the issue of identity. And here she's, attaching the idea of identity to promise without actually linking it to the who, and definitely not the what. And I wanted to know, your thoughts about it, because in my reading of Arendt and in my understanding, this is a few instances in which the word identity, is present.
All right. Without being bound to the fulfillment of promises, we would never be able to keep our identities. Right. So in that sense, what is an identity? It's to be part of a kind of a collective, whether, oh shit. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry.
Not quoting that in the answer.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought I quit. I thought my Zoom went out. Somehow my screen disappeared for a second. I apologize for that. That was uncalled for. Identities, I think, are some sort of part of a collective action, collective group, that without them and without promising that allows that, we would be condemned to wander helplessly and without direction in the darkness of each man's lonely heart, caught in its contradictions and equivocalities, a darkness which only the light shed over the public realm through the presence of others who confirm the identity between the one who promises and the one who fulfills can dispel. So in promising, not only do I join myself with you, but others recognize our collectivity, our identity, and give us confirm it. Thus, identity depends upon plurality. It depends upon not only other people who I promise with, but it also depends upon other people who disagree with us or are not part of our mutual promise, who recognize our promise, right? You can't be a master without a slave, and you can't be a Jew without a Christian, or a non-Jew. So I think that's what she's saying here, if that helps, Mara. I don't know.
For me, it's problematic because, of course, there's an intersubjective element there, and it's a kind of psychoanalytical element in, in getting your identity, in a web of human relations. But I don't really. What I don't see, well, that she doesn't problematize is actually who makes the promises, what those promises are, and it can be a self-fulfilling promise, right? In a way, in terms of the what and not the who. So I have to think more about it. I have more confusion than actual clarity about this, but I stopped on that paragraph. So
Yeah.
Thank you for your comments.
Thank you. You and me both. Lena.
Thank you, Roger. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you. I wanted to say before my question is like, I really enjoy the discussion around love and children. And I do think that having children in a way, at least it happened to me, it made me extremely political. And in a way, it brings you really as an activist into the world. So I kind of feel I understand what she's saying here. Now, but my question is a bit more, I think it's a bit simplistic, but something I struggled with is this. So she talks about, and this is on page 240, she talks about the idea of forgiveness. And she says, only through this constant mutual release from what they do can men remain free agents. Only by constant willingness to change their minds and start again can they be trusted with so great a power as that to begin something new. So in a way, it's about releasing someone, it's about forgiveness. And then on the other hand, there is this idea of promise. Now for me, promise is about future, and in a way it's almost like the opposite. It's about locking yourself into something. So for example, when you take the vows, or you promise yourself to somebody and so on. So it seems almost like opposite of forgiveness and this idea of a release. So I just wanted to ask you if you could kind of explain this a bit, this relationship between promise and forgiveness, a kind of a release as a forgiveness, and promise, which is about, future, and in my view, locking yourself into the idea of something. Thank you.
You're right. Yeah, the burden of action means that we, on the one hand, acting is going to lead to us doing potential wrongs or unintendedly bad things, and we need a mutual release in order to in a sense allow us to continue acting. On the other hand, the burdens of action mean that we can't ever know that our promises and our actions will lead where we want them to go, and thus we can't have faith that when we become Jews or Muslims, or when we join Black Lives Matter or a Tea Party, that we will be able to master what we do. And so the price of that, the danger, the burden is that we lose our freedom to control the outcome of our actions. These are the burdens of action. And one response to it is we release ourselves from it. And two is that while we can't ever master the future, we can create what she calls islands of predictability. We can create temporary assurances through promising that allow us, even though we don't know what the end result will be, allow us to have faith that some of our actions, at least for a certain amount of time, will lead where we want them to go. And even though that those islands are constantly in danger of being flooded and overrun by waters of unpredictability, right? Sorry to speak in that metaphor. The challenge of being free is in a plural society is to constantly work to preserve those islands insofar as they are meaningful to us. I don't know how much more I can say about it right now.
Okay, no, that's quite interesting. But in a way, that's almost like the opposite of the idea of work and some kind of immortality through work. Because if you are putting yourself towards these temporal assurances, you are just doing it for so in a way, with action, you can never be sure, you can never be certain. Whilst maybe with, say, artwork, you would want to maybe potentially reach that greatness that we talked about, and kind of immortality, as if. So it's almost like it's different in that sense, because it's not for certain.
That's right. And work is always got a means ends rationality, whereas action is not.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Robert.
First, can you understand me?
You're a little.
Can you understand me?
I'll try. Yeah, you're a little bit slow, but I'll try.
Okay. Like Susan, having difficulty with locating the example of Arendt's notion of action as opposed to work or pre-political constitution making. I have difficulty understanding what's an appropriate object.
We don't understand. We don't understand it.
I'm getting most of it.
You
So
want me to drop it now? Or do I go on?
All right. Rado, we don't
understand.
The last very part I didn't, because we were interrupted.
Sorry.
Say it again, Rado.
Okay. Consider these: truth and reconciliation committees. Okay.
All right, Robert, I think I'm gonna, can you type, Robert, can you type your question in the chat?
Examples. Truth and
Robert, can you type your question in the chat? Because we can't really hear you. Robert,
what are appropriate examples for forgiveness? I have trouble thinking of any. Suppose
okay, Robert,
the CDC's decision on mask wearing yesterday. Yeah.
So, Robert, you asked about appropriate.
Okay.
You asked about what might be examples of forgiveness. I got that.
Yes.
In
I
some.
will.
Okay.
Yes, I will.
I think there's obviously an echo here or a delay. appropriate examples of forgiveness or examples of forgiveness are simply, you know, it's interesting. I mean, think about one of the things that Arendt, you know, is going to say in her book, in her essay, Lying in Politics and Other Places, is that part of politics is lying, right? You have to be willing, if you want to make changes, you've got to sort of refigure the world. And to some degree, that may mean lying. You know, politicians have lied throughout history. Part of one example of mutual release or forgiveness, as she's talking about it in this section, is that we forgive politicians for their lies in the interest of their agenda. In the sense that, you know, yeah, we call them out on it sometimes, we want to dispute it, but we understand that when people exaggerate or misstate something or slightly mischaracterize it in the name of a political project, we accept that and we allow them to continue to be politicians. One of the changes in the last period is that we've suddenly demanded and come to believe that because politicians tell some lies, all of politics is a lie, and that all politics are hypocrites. And we've created this idea that you can't that any lie or any in the language of this text, trespass is unforgivable, and thus we discredit all of politics. It's one of the reasons Arendt says that some hypocrisy is necessary, and that the hunt to get rid of all hypocrites leads to terror. And I think not only did that happen during the French Revolution, you can start to see it happening in our time today. If every time you think about the sort of cancel league idea, right? If every time, you know, just an example, this guy who was hired by Apple, who had written in this book talking about his wife and how great his wife was, and he thought his wife was this strong woman. And he has this paragraph in this book, which was a best-selling book, about how most women in the Bay Area are weak and in an apocalypse would not survive, unlike my wife. Well, the people who got him fired from Apple took the first part of the quote, right, about the Bay Area and the weak women and they couldn't survive, left out the context and the second part of the quote about his wife, and in an unforgiving way said, this man is a misogynist and he shouldn't be allowed to work for Apple. We can agree or disagree on whether someone should have to work under someone like who has these views of women. I mean, I think it's a legitimate claim, but the point is, it's an unforgiving political culture. It's one that, this is a book he wrote years ago about his wife and praising her. And what we saw is that, the attacks on him and the attempts to cancel or get him fired were ones that simply take a trespass, in Arendt's terms, certainly not a sin. It's not like he killed anyone or beat anyone up, and say that it is not something we can forgive. And that people who, and what it means for Arendt is that people who are going to act in public are going to pull back even further, right? This is the argument. I know that's a controversial example. It just came up today, but it was on my mind. But that's an example of forgiving or not forgiving that I think Arendt would recognize.
Roger, can I just say something about what you just said about that man? Can I say something quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure people don't agree with everything I said.
Yeah, no, agreeing or not, the point is that you're saying that, you know, he didn't kill anyone. This is not a sin. His punishment also was not commensurate with killing someone or committing a sin, but a trespass. So you can defend the fact, his punishment, in this case, the fact that he was fired, by thinking that that's commensurate with the idea of trespass. He's not fit to represent perhaps a community because of such a view. And that's all I wanted to say. Just point out that he's not getting hanged for it.
He did not get hanged. I think from an Arendtian point of view, though, it's I wasn't trying to, like I said, I actually was not trying to take a position on whether he should be fired or not. I was simply saying it's an illustration of an unforgiving stance towards public action. One view is whether you agree with what he said about his wife and women or not, everyone has, people say things that he was doing it in a literary, none of the people who are criticizing him have actually read the book, right? They're not criticizing like an attempt, they're taking something out of context, right? Again, I'm not defending or not Apple's decision to fire him or people's decision to attack him. I'm simply saying it's an unforgiving stance about how we interpret people's public attitudes, because there is nobody who acts in public who, if you take something they said out of context, there is nobody who acts in public, if you take something they said out of context, who will not have said things that are offensive and maybe even reprehensible. And if we're going to take that as our criteria, we live in a very unforgiving society in which more and more people will make the rational decision simply to publish nothing and act and not act. That I take to be, that's the point I was trying to make. Do people hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
I wasn't sure because it looks like things were frozen.
No.
John.
Thank you. She makes an incredible statement for me on page 246, where she, and I think it ties into what we're talking about, that near the bottom of the page, where she says, the ever-present reminder that men, though they must die, are not born in order to die, but in order to begin. And I take that as implicit that there has to be choices. One makes choices and to begin something. And therefore, when it comes to forgiveness, in making choices, there's error, or can be, as we were just discussing. And so you do need the essence of forgiveness. And, but what I'm having difficulty in understanding, where in this point of being, of beginning, or the schematic of that, how does evil fit into this?
Well, I mean, when you begin an action, you can do it with evil intents or not, right? And whatever your intents, evil or not, your action can lead to evil or not. So evil.
So is evil simply a human choice?
Well, there's
then to be defended or eliminated, or to be subject to the criteria of the present norms and standards of society, or is there a constant for her?
Well, there's different aspects of evil. There's the willful evil, right, which is the sinful part of evil, and then there's the act. In law, we speak. I mean, I don't know any lawyers here, but we divide all crimes into two parts. Mens rea, which is the evil will, right? The evil mind, mens rea, the evil thing. the reus, the evil mind, and the actus reus, the evil act. And so in all evil, there's two parts, at least in our law, and I think Arendt is actually consistent with that approach. So what she's saying is that our intent, may or may not matter, but in the end, whatever our intent, whether we have radical evil intent or good intent, our actions could lead to radical evil or radical good. It's not up to us.
Well, if man is, if the purpose of man is to begin, then, and the choice of evil is personal, only to be judged thereafter by its actions and its consequences or its results, that leaves to me that man is is a random animal, that there's horrific randomness to everyone's existence.
Yes, there's a certain randomness. This is what she calls the lack of mastery, the lack of sovereignty, and plurality. Right? That's the I mean, I don't know if that's exactly what you meant, but for her, the whole premise of her work is that we can't master and bring under any kind of making human control the human world, because it's a world of plurality.
Well, I'm struggling. There seems to be in my mind, and I can't define it, a gap in terms of purpose and why. And I can't even articulate a question that makes any sense to me. But I just feel there's something absent in this. For me, in this discussion of human existence, if my purpose is just to begin, as she defines it.
Well, your purpose, that's a good, I think I now understand your question, John. The purpose, I don't think she thinks there's any, I take this to be the thrust of your question. I may be misunderstanding it. I don't think she thinks there's any theological purpose for man. I do think she thinks that the human condition, as it's evolved and conditions man, has led to a purpose emerging for man, which is to be meaningful, and that the path to meaning is through beginning and action. This book is about the fact that as action becomes more and more tenuous and less probable and possible, so does the purpose and meaning of man. That's the thesis of the book. But there's no theological pre-given or natural purpose to man for Arendt.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to, could I make a quick comment?
Alex, just because we're short on time, let me at least get Aldo's question in, because he's been waiting.
I would like to ask a question too.
All right, well, we're short on time, so I'm going to try and get Aldo in, and then Susan, if you can, I'll try and get you in. But Aldo.
Hi, hi, Roger. Thank you. Yeah, I'm still a little haunted about violence and violence in action, in the sense that is violence part of, can be violence considered an action? I mean, for instance, when in the book is quoted the Achilles' deeds and words, those deeds were bloody ones. I mean, involved violent acts. So, can violence be considered part of the action, or or is from a different realm?
Definitely. I mean, Arendt says that, violence is not the same as power, but violence can, in certain circumstances, start something new. So for example, if you look in this chapter on the discussion of the difference between revenge and punishment, on page 241, she says the problem with revenge is that it's a mere automatic reaction. You kill my friend, I kill your friend, and then you kill my friend, and I kill your friend, and I kill your friend, and you kill my friend, and it doesn't end. And so violence can start a process, but it rarely, so it starts a new process, but it doesn't create anything meaningful. Whereas punishment, she says in the next paragraph, the opposite of the alternative to forgiveness is not its opposite, is punishment. In that both forgiveness and punishment attempt to put an end to something. They attempt to start something new by in a sense ending a cycle, and have in common that they attempt to put an end to something that without interference could go on endlessly. It is therefore quite significant, a structural element in the realm of human affairs, that men are unable to forgive what they cannot punish, and that they're unable to punish what has turned out to be unforgivable. And obviously she's here talking about the Holocaust.
But so she's taking, there is a violence that is not making, for instance?
Punishment is a violence, right? If I take the death penalty, right? There's a lot of people who say some people are so opposed to killing that they'll kill anyone who commits it. And they make it seem like the death penalty is an act of revenge. It's just kill, 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 kill. But punishment in the law is not an act of revenge and killing for killing. It's an act of judgment in which we say that someone's who willfully takes the life of another needs to be has their will has turned away from their good. They've willfully turned away from law, and they need to be turned back around by a proportional punishment. And the only way to proportionally turn that hard heart around is by making them feel the injustice that their will executed, and to then re-establish justice. So the argument from a retributive theory of punishment is that it's not simply killing for killing, it's restoring law. So the Hegelian formulation of this is das Recht kommt zum Werk nur an die Abhebung seiner Verletzung. Law only comes to work in the Aufhebung, in the canceling and elevating and raising up of its injury. And so once the law is injured, you need to cancel and raise up that its injury, and punishment is what does that. That's the sort of classic Christian / Hegelian / rational legal theory, and Arendt embraces that in all of her works. She thinks there's a meaning to it, and so in that sense, violence can do justice. She also, in her essay on violence, thinks there's that some acts of violence, if they are if they are seen as just, can actually reestablish justice and make us aware of injustice and reestablish justice.
Excuse me, a last comment. So this violence is different from the violence she talked about homophobia. It's different from making. So
yeah,
it's a different violence, is it?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, we're sort of out of time, but Susan, you wanted to say something quickly?
Just briefly. I mean, ironically, this is exactly what I wanted to talk about. because I mean, one of the things that's always kind of haunted me about Eichmann, you know, is the question of, in a sense, who decides?
Say, who decides what?
Who decides that someone's act is so beyond the pale?
Yeah. Okay.
That they need to be thrown into the sea.
Right. So
and I just wanted to sort of tie that up with the whole restorative justice movement and the question of, you know, the importance of the personal encounter, let's say, between the perpetrator and the victim, so that there can be apparently some kind of redemption, and how complicated that is, because if someone you love has been killed, I mean, I come at this from having been a criminal defense lawyer and worked on mass incarceration for years.
Yeah.
So I'm very sympathetic with this. And at the same time, I think it's problematic.
Yeah. So, I mean, on the Eichmann, who decides question is a great question. I mean, what Arendt says in the end of Eichmann is the judges should have no monopoly on the decision, because it's not a legal decision. It's not about punishment. It's about whether to reconcile with it or not. And thus, she thinks everyone has to make that as a political decision. So she offers her final judgment of Eichmann, not as a judge, but as one person making her political judgment and sentence of Eichmann that he must be expunged from the earth. And I think what she's saying is that it should be a judgment such that when other people see it, they have to ask themselves, do I agree with it or not? And yeah, that's what makes it an action. So I take that to be her argument about who makes that decision. Okay, we are out of time. Alex, did you want to say something very quickly?
Sure. I wonder if, yeah, I mean, it was a response to what somebody had raised, this, you know, the thing I'm very curious about is this connection between the beginning and something like life, because it often seems to me like, and I think this is often coming up in questions that people are raising, you know, like how does a beginning relate to, you know, what happens after? What about the middle? You know, people were mentioning, for example, having children, and how it seems like, you know, love in some sense only begins in the beginning, but then there is the question of, you know, raising the children and spending the time kind of, you know, having the life that beginning has begun, right? And I'm very curious about that connection, you know, like between politics in Arendt's sense and then something like life. And especially because she seems to rank life kind of low on the ladder, right? And you know, and I would want to say, well, to me, it seems like politics is actually a kind of life. It's a form of life, you know. And to that line that somebody quoted, you know, man is not born to die but to begin. To me, it seems like the natural ending of that is actually man is born to live. Right, that's kind of what I think we might want to say there.
I think that's fair. That's great. And let's end on that. Man is born to, well, I mean, let me just say, for her, man is not born to die, but he's also not born to live. I don't think you can say that for her. I mean, I understand why you would say that. I think that's what she's going to be criticizing in this book. Now, man is born to live a meaningful life, or at least that's how he's been born up until now. She thinks that's changing. And by the way, she thinks it's changing in the direction Alex just said, that man is being increasingly born to live. And as she said at the beginning of the book, we're here to think what we are doing and decide if that's a good thing or not. And in many ways, that's the question of the book. Thank you all. An exciting conversation. Look forward to seeing you next week, and please enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. I'll talk to you soon.